long before missiles pierced the skies over Jerusalem, long before Iran became a name that strikes fear into the hearts of nations, there was a whisper in the ancient halls of eternity, a covenant written not in ink, but in blood, not on parchment, but upon the very fabric of time itself. What if I told you that every headline screaming from your television tonight, every threat echoing from Tehran, every prayer rising from the streets of Jerusalem, was already seen, already written, already planned by a hand that moves through history like a potter shaping clay? The year is 2024. The world holds its breath as ancient enemies circle like wolves in the darkness. Iran threatens annihilation. Israel stands defiant. And somewhere in the shadows of your spirit, you feel it, don't you? That this isn't just politics, this isn't just war, this is something deeper. Something that was set in motion long before any of us drew our first breath. But here's what they don't want you to know. Here's the question that haunts the corridors of seminaries and trembles in the whispered prayers of saints. Has God, has the Almighty, abandoned his chosen people? Did Israel lose its sacred place when they turned away from their Messiah? Or is there something hidden in the ancient texts? Something buried beneath centuries of doctrine and debate? Something that changes everything? Tonight, we're going to crack open a mystery that has been sealed for 2,000 years. We're going to trace the fingerprints of the divine across the blood-stained pages of history, from the courts of ancient Persia to the war rooms of modern Tehran, from Abraham's tent to the valley of dry bones, from the first covenant to the final prophecy. Because what if the very existence of Israel today isn't just survival? What if it's prophecy? What if every bomb that falls, every treaty that's signed, every tear that's shed in the Holy Land is part of a story that was written before the stars knew their names? Before we dive into these sacred waters together, I want to thank every single one of you who has supported this message through Super Thanks. Your generosity means more than you know. You're not just donating, you're helping spread light to others who feel alone in their calling. Whether you give or not, I'm deeply grateful for your presence here, your support, your time, your attention. It all matters. And if this message resonates with your soul, if you feel that holy stirring that says this is truth, then I invite you to plant a seed in faith. The question that will haunt your dreams tonight is this: if God truly abandoned Israel, then who is he protecting when the missiles fall? And if he hasn't abandoned them, what does that mean for the rest of us when the final trumpet sounds? Stay with me. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about God's plan for the end of days. Before Persia had a name, it was a whisper in the dust breathed through the bloodlines of Shem and Japheth. Picture this: the earth, washed clean by 40 days of divine judgment. The ark settles on Mount Ararat, and from its wooden belly emerge 8 souls, the only beating hearts left on a planet scrubbed raw by the wrath of God. Noah steps onto soil that has never known human footprints. His 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, carry within their veins the genetic blueprint of every nation that would ever rise, every kingdom that would ever fall, every empire that would ever challenge the throne of heaven. But God doesn't roll dice with destiny. He doesn't scatter nations like seeds on the wind and hope for the best. No, the Almighty is an architect of eternity. And in Genesis 10, the table of nations, we glimpse his divine blueprint. Every name listed isn't just a genealogy, it's a prophecy. Every bloodline traced isn't just ancestry, it's assignment. From Japheth, the eldest, came a son named Madai. From the loins of Shem, the blessed, came Elam. 2 names, 2 brothers, 2 destinies that would intertwine like twin rivers flowing toward a collision with the God of Abraham. Madai, the father of the Medes, fierce mountain warriors who would carve their kingdom from stone and snow, ruling from fortresses that kissed the clouds. Their hearts beat with the rhythm of war drums. Their souls were forged in the fire of conquest. They knew nothing of mercy, nothing of the God who breathed life into Adam's nostrils, but heaven knew them. Elam, the patriarch of a people who would settle in the fertile plains of what we now call southwestern Iran. Unlike their mountain cousins, the Elamites built cities, not castles. They were merchants and kings, traders and diplomats. Their hands were stained with gold, not just blood. Their empire stretched like fingers reaching toward Babylon, toward the very heart of civilization itself. What if I told you that these 2 forgotten names, Madai and Elam, weren't just ancient history? What if they were the first whispers of a story that would echo through the corridors of eternity, from the courts of Nebuchadnezzar to the war rooms of modern Tehran? You see, when the Bible records these genealogies, it's not keeping a family tree, it's revealing a battle plan. Because in the mind of God, nations aren't accidents of geography or politics. They are instruments. Some are hammers, some are shields, some are swords waiting to be drawn at the appointed hour. The Medes and the Elamites, the twin foundations of what would become the Persian Empire, were being positioned on the chessboard of history long before they knew they were playing a game. Their children would multiply. Their territories would expand. Their armies would march. But none of it was random. All of it was written. Centuries would pass. Kingdoms would rise and fall like waves against the shore. Babylon would enslave Israel. Egypt would oppress them. Assyria would scatter them like leaves in a hurricane. But all the while, in the mountains of Media and the plains of Elam, something was stirring. A power was gathering. A king was being prepared. And here's what will make your spirit tremble. God had already seen him. Before the first Persian child drew breath, before the first Median sword was forged, before Media and Persia ever dreamed of uniting under one crown, heaven had already written his name in the scroll of destiny. What if the oldest wars weren't born from land, but from bloodlines? What if the conflicts we see blazing across our television screens tonight, the missiles streaking toward Jerusalem, the threats echoing from Iran, the ancient hatred that refuses to die, what if all of it traces back to this moment? To two brothers standing in the shadow of Ararat, carrying in their blood the seeds of nations that would one day stand at the very center of God's final act? Because here's the truth that will haunt your dreams. When God scattered the nations at Babel, he wasn't just dividing languages, he was assigning roles. Some peoples would carry his covenant, others would test it. Some would build his temple, others would threaten to tear it down. And in the bloodlines of Madai and Elam, the Almighty was already preparing both destroyer and deliverer, enemy and instrument, sword and shield. The Persians didn't know they were prophecy walking on two legs. They thought they were just building an empire. They thought they were just conquering cities and expanding borders. They had no idea that every victory, every defeat, every rise and fall was already written in the stars by a God they didn't even acknowledge. But from these forgotten names would rise a king whom heaven had already crowned long before he took his first breath. His name was Cyrus, and the scroll of Isaiah held it before his mother ever saw his face. Picture this. In the chambers of Jerusalem, nearly 150 years before Babylon would even dream of burning Solomon's temple, the prophet Isaiah lifts his reed pen. The Spirit of the Almighty moves upon him like wind across still waters. And in that sacred moment, he writes a name that will echo through eternity. Not the name of a king of Israel, not the name of a priest or prophet, but the name of a pagan emperor who will not draw breath for another century and a half. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue nations before him. Anointed, the Hebrew word Mashiach, the same word reserved for David, the same word that would one day be spoken over the Messiah himself. And here, flowing from the prophet's pen like liquid fire, it falls upon a man who does not know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a man who will bow before idols of silver and gold, a man whose empire will stretch from the Indus River to the shores of the Mediterranean. What kind of God writes the name of a foreign king into his sacred scroll before that king's grandfather is even born? The answer will shatter everything you think you know about divine sovereignty. While Isaiah's ink dried upon the parchment, time moved like a river toward its appointed banks. Empires rose and fell. Babylon swallowed Assyria. Nebuchadnezzar's armies swept through Jerusalem like locusts through wheat fields. The temple burned. The sacred vessels were carried away as trophies. And the children of Israel, God's chosen people, were dragged in chains across the desert to a land that did not know their songs. For 70 years, they wept by the rivers of Babylon. 70 years of exile. 70 years of wondering if the God of their fathers had forgotten his promises. Their harps hung silent on the willow trees. Their psalms became laments. And still, in the archives of heaven, a scroll waited with a name already written. Then, in the eastern mountains of what we now call Iran, a child was born to royalty. His mother, Mandane, was a Median princess. His father, Cambyses, a Persian king. The boy's name meant son in the ancient tongue. But in the scrolls of prophecy, he was already called something else entirely. Shepherd, anointed, the right hand of the Most High. Young Cyrus grew in wisdom and stature, trained in the arts of war and governance. He learned to read the movements of armies like a shepherd reads the sky. He conquered the Medes. He subdued Lydia, the kingdom of golden Croesus. One by one, the nations fell before his advancing banners like wheat before the sickle. But the greatest prize still glittered in the distance: Babylon, the jewel of empires, the cage that held God's people captive. And on a night when the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, Cyrus stood before the walls of Babylon, the city that had never fallen, the city protected by the Euphrates River and walls so thick that chariots could race upon their ramparts, the city where Daniel prayed 3 times daily toward Jerusalem, the city where Ezekiel had seen the glory of God depart from the temple in a vision of wheels within wheels. But here's what sends chills down the spine of every believer. Cyrus didn't conquer Babylon. He entered it like a key, turning in a lock that had been designed for his hand before the foundation of the world. The Persian engineers diverted the Euphrates. The river that had protected Babylon for centuries became a highway for liberation. Cyrus's soldiers walked through the empty riverbed beneath the city walls. The gates, those massive bronze barriers that should have held against any army, stood open as if invisible hands had unlatched them in the darkness. And Belshazzar, the king who had mocked the God of Israel by drinking wine from the sacred temple vessels, died that very night, just as Daniel had prophesied, just as the writing on the wall had declared. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. But here's where the story becomes more than history. Here's where it becomes prophecy fulfilled before our very eyes. When Cyrus took the throne of Babylon, something unprecedented happened, something that no conqueror in the ancient world had ever done. He opened the prison doors. Not just for political prisoners, not just for valuable slaves. He opened them for a people he had never seen, who worshipped a God he did not know, in a land he had never visited. The decree went out like thunder across the empire. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a house for him at Jerusalem. Can you imagine the trembling that ran through the Jewish communities scattered across Babylon? Can you picture the aged men who remembered Jerusalem weeping as they read those words? Can you feel the electricity that must have coursed through Daniel's veins as he recognized the hand of his God moving through the heart of a pagan king? But Cyrus didn't just grant permission. He funded the impossible. He returned the sacred temple vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had stolen. He provided silver and gold for the reconstruction. He gave timber from Lebanon's cedars. He assigned Persian officials to oversee safe passage back to the Promised Land. A foreign emperor became the financier of Israel's resurrection. Now here's the question that should haunt every believer's sleep. How did Cyrus know? How did a pagan king who worshipped fire and light suddenly develop a passion for the God of an enslaved people? The answer lies in a name you know well: Daniel. Picture the scene. An aged prophet, now in his 80s, approaches the throne of the most powerful man on earth. In his weathered hands, he carries a scroll, the scroll of Isaiah. And as Cyrus reads his own name written by a Hebrew prophet 150 years before his birth, something shifts in the cosmic order. I summon you by name, though you do not acknowledge me, the text declared. I will go before you and level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron. Every gate that had opened, every mountain of opposition that had crumbled, every victory that had seemed too easy, it had all been orchestrated by a God whose ways are higher than the heavens. And Cyrus, emperor of the known world, bowed his head before a prophecy that proved the God of Israel writes history before it happens. What if your greatest deliverance came from the hand of one who did not even know your God? What if the very throne that seems most opposed to his purposes is already moving according to his sovereign will? What if the kings who threaten his people today are merely playing roles already written in scrolls they cannot read? Because here's the truth that should make every believer bold and every enemy tremble. Our God doesn't just work through the faithful. He commandeers the rebellious. He doesn't just move through those who know his name. He can reach into the heart of any king, any president, any emperor, and turn it like water in his hand. The children of Israel returned to Jerusalem singing songs their grandparents had taught them about a city they had never seen. They laid the foundation of a new temple, while the old men who remembered Solomon's glory wept with joy so loud it could be heard for miles. And all because a pagan king read his name in a Hebrew scroll and recognized the signature of eternity. But Persia's mercy would be tested when hatred grew not from outside the throne, but from within it. She hid her name, But heaven had already revealed her purpose. In the glittering courts of Susa, where gold dripped from marble columns and the scent of frankincense masked the stench of political schemes, a young Jewish woman walked corridors that had never known her God. Her lips spoke Persian, her gown bore royal silk, but her heart carried the blood of Abraham, and heaven was watching. What if I told you that the most dangerous moment in Jewish history wasn't the Holocaust, wasn't the Babylonian siege, but a single signature on a Persian scroll? A decree that would have erased God's chosen people from the earth before the Messiah could ever be born? The year was 474 BC. King Xerxes, the same monarch who would later march against Greece with 1 million men, ruled an empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia. 127 provinces bowed before his throne. And somewhere in that vast dominion, scattered like sheep without a shepherd, lived the remnant of Israel. They had grown comfortable in their exile, comfortable enough to let their guard down, comfortable enough to forget that ancient hatred never sleeps. Enter Haman, descendant of Agag, son of the Amalekites, that cursed bloodline God had commanded Saul to utterly destroy. What Saul left undone in mercy would now rise in vengeance. Haman bore more than political ambition. He carried the ancient rage of a people whose very existence was an affront to Israel's covenant. When Mordecai the Jew refused to bow before Haman's elevated throne, something older than politics stirred in that palace. Something that hissed with the same serpentine hatred that whispered in Eden. It wasn't enough to kill one defiant Jew. The entire race had to be eliminated. Every man, woman, and child. Every memory, every prayer, every whispered hope of Messiah. But here's the mystery that should make you tremble. At the exact moment Haman was plotting genocide, God had already placed his answer in the king's bed. Esther, Hadassah, the orphan girl whose Hebrew name meant myrtle, a tree that releases its fragrance only when crushed. She had been chosen for the crown before she ever knew she was chosen for the cross. Think about this divine choreography. Years before Haman ever drew his lots, before his hatred ever found its voice, God was already moving pieces across the board. A beauty contest that seemed like pagan vanity was actually a prophetic appointment. A Jewish girl hiding her identity was actually fulfilling her destiny. When the royal edict went out, when the 13th day of Adar was marked for Jewish extermination, when the lots were cast and the genocide was legalized, Mordecai sent word to his cousin with words that still echo through eternity. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Can you hear the weight in those words? This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was providence dressed as politics. But here's what terrifies me about Esther's story, and what should terrify you. She almost said no. I have not been called to see the king for 30 days, she protested. Anyone who approaches the king uninvited faces death unless he extends the golden scepter. The crown she wore was also her potential coffin. The position that gave her access also threatened her with execution. Sometimes God's calling comes wrapped in what looks like a death sentence. But Mordecai's response cuts through every excuse, every fear, every rational objection. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Translation: God's plan doesn't depend on your obedience, but your blessing does. For 3 days, Esther fasted. For 3 days, she prepared to die. And on the 3rd day, the same pattern that would later mark the resurrection, she arose and put on her royal robes. Picture this scene. A young woman walking uninvited into the presence of the most powerful man on earth. Every step could be her last. Every breath might be her final prayer, but she's not walking alone. The God who split the Red Sea is splitting the tension in that throne room. Xerxes raised the golden scepter. The banquet invitations went out. Haman preened in his pride, believing he was being honored, but he was actually being positioned for judgment. At the second feast, with wine flowing and guards watching, Esther dropped the revelation that shattered an empire. I am a Jew, and we have been sold for destruction. The silence in that room must have been deafening. The king who thought he knew his queen discovered he had married his enemy's target. The man who thought he was honoring Haman realized he had been harboring a genocidal maniac. Justice came swift as lightning. The gallows Haman had built for Mordecai became his own execution platform. 75 feet high, tall enough for all of Susa to see that heaven avenges the blood of the innocent. But here's the deeper revelation that most miss. the decree couldn't be reversed. Persian law was immutable. So instead of canceling the death warrant, the king issued a new decree. The Jews could defend themselves. What was meant for slaughter became a day of victory. What was designed for funeral became a festival. The 13th of Adar, marked for Jewish extinction, became the 14th of Adar Purim, the celebration of divine reversal. Do you see the pattern? Do you understand the prophetic template? When the enemy builds gallows for God's people, those same gallows become the stage for God's glory. When hatred reaches its crescendo, heaven's symphony drowns it out. Esther's story isn't just ancient history. It's a living prophecy. Every time Israel faces annihilation, God positions his chosen in the places of power. Every time the lots are cast for destruction, heaven has already cast the die for deliverance. Today, as Iran's leaders echo Haman's ancient threats, as they cast their modern lots for Israel's destruction, remember this. The same God who raised up Esther is still raising up his instruments. The same God who reversed Haman's plot is still writing reversals. Could you risk everything to save a covenant you can no longer see? Could you walk uninvited into the presence of power to intercede for a people not your own? Could you wear your crown knowing it might become your cross? But Persia would not always wear the face of a deliverer soon. It would wear the mask of prophecy's final storm. In the silence of Babylon, a Hebrew exile saw silver in the statue's chest and Persia rising in its breath. Picture this. The most powerful king on earth tosses and turns in his bed, haunted by a dream so vivid, so terrifying, that it strips the sleep from his eyes and the peace from his soul. Nebuchadnezzar, ruler of the world's mightiest empire, master of nations, trembles like a child in the darkness. He has seen something that reaches beyond the borders of his kingdom, beyond the span of his lifetime, beyond the grip of his understanding. The dream came like thunder in the night, a towering statue, magnificent and terrible, gleaming in divine light. Its head was pure gold brilliant, beautiful, proud. Its chest and arms were silver, strong, but somehow lesser. Its belly and thighs were bronze, darker still. Its legs were iron, brutal and unyielding. And its feet, the feet were a mixture of iron and clay, fragile and fractured, waiting to crumble. But here's what shook the king to his core. He couldn't remember the dream. It slipped through his fingers like sand, leaving only the terror, only the certainty that he had glimpsed something eternal, something that would determine the fate of every kingdom, every throne, every crown that would ever exist. And then came Daniel, young Daniel, torn from Jerusalem as a boy, standing now in the court of his captors. Daniel, who had refused to bow to golden idols, who had kept his face turned toward the God of Abraham even in the shadow of Babylon's towers. When the king's wise men cowered in terror, when sorcerers and magicians fell silent before an impossible demand, Daniel stepped forward with the quiet confidence of a man who knows that heaven holds all secrets. There is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, Daniel declared, his voice cutting through the palace like a sword of light. And then, with words that would echo through history, he unveiled not just the dream, but the divine blueprint hidden within it. The golden head, Daniel revealed, was Babylon itself, glorious, dominant, but destined to fade. The silver chest and arms? This was the empire that would rise from the east, the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. 2 arms, 2 peoples, united in conquest but divided in power. The bronze belly and thighs represented Greece, swift and gleaming under Alexander's banner. The iron legs were Rome, crushing all beneath its military might. And those fragile feet of iron and clay, a final kingdom, partly strong, partly broken, standing at the end of days. But focus now on that silver chest, gleaming in the divine light. Persia, the empire that would conquer Babylon, that would free God's people, that would rebuild his temple. Daniel saw it centuries before it happened. He watched Cyrus rise in a vision before Cyrus even drew breath. He witnessed the fall of empires and the birth of nations as God unrolled his scroll of time. What Daniel glimpsed in that moment was more than political succession. He was seeing the heartbeat of heaven, the rhythm by which the Almighty moves kingdoms like chess pieces across the board of history. Every empire that has ever risen, every throne that has ever been established, every crown that has ever been worn of it flows according to a pattern set before the world began. The empires of man are not accidents of power. They are chapters in heaven's blueprint. And Persia? Persia was no accident. When Daniel saw that silver chest, he was watching God position his instrument of deliverance. The very empire that would humble Babylon was the same empire that would lift up Israel. The hand that would topple the golden head would be the same hand that would open the prison doors of exile. But here's what will leave you breathless. Daniel didn't just see the rise of Persia, he saw its fall. In another vision, years later, he watched a ram with 2 horns sewn higher than the other charging across the earth with unstoppable fury. This was Media Persia, the empire that would seem invincible, that would stretch from India to Ethiopia, that would rule with iron authority over 127 provinces. And then, swift as lightning, a goat appeared from the west. 1 horn, 1 leader, moving so fast his feet barely touched the ground. This was Greece, and the horn was Alexander the Great. In the vision, the goat struck the ram with furious power, shattering both horns, trampling the mighty empire beneath his feet. Daniel saw it all, the glory and the downfall, the silver chest rising and falling in the span of a divine breath. He witnessed the rise of Cyrus and the conquest of Alexander, separated by 2 centuries but united in a single moment of prophetic sight. What if I told you that every headline in your morning paper was already written in the dreams of an exile? What if every missile launched, every alliance formed, every threat issued between Israel and Iran today is simply the echo of silver striking bronze in an ancient vision? The statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream wasn't just about succession of power. It was about the temporary nature of all earthly kingdoms. Gold fades to silver, silver tarnishes to bronze, bronze corrodes to iron, and iron, for all its strength, crumbles when mixed with clay. But there was something else in that dream, something that should make your soul tremble with anticipation. Daniel saw a stone, cut without human hands, that struck the statue's feet and brought the entire monument crashing down. That stone became a mountain that filled the whole earth. That stone is the kingdom of heaven. That mountain is the reign of the Messiah. And every empire that has ever stood, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and all that have followed are but shadows dancing before the light of that eternal throne. Persia rose as silver in God's statue. It conquered as the ram in Daniel's vision. It freed Israel as Cyrus in Isaiah's prophecy. But it also fell, just as surely as it rose, because no earthly kingdom can stand forever in the presence of the kingdom that has no end. What if the empire that rescued you is also the one foretold to fall? Today, as Iran stands opposite Israel in a dance of destiny, remember this: you are not watching the birth of conflict. You are watching the final movements of a drama that began in a Babylonian dream. The silver is still gleaming, but the bronze is already rising, and somewhere in the shadows of fallen thrones, a deeper enemy stirred not of flesh, but of flame. For 21 days, an angel could not break through because Persia had a prince, not of earth, but of darkness. What if I told you that every headline you read about Iran, every missile launched, every threat declared, is merely the shadow of a war that began before the foundations of the world were laid? What if the real battle for the Middle East isn't fought in war rooms or on battlefields, but in the unseen realm where principalities and powers clash over the destiny of nations? Daniel knew this secret. He had lived through the rise and fall of Babylon. He had witnessed the dreams of kings crumble into dust. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to discover about the spiritual forces governing the empire that had become his home. It was the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the same Cyrus who had freed God's people, the same empire that had rebuilt the temple. Yet Daniel, now an old man weathered by decades of exile, felt a burden pressing upon his spirit like a stone upon his chest. For 3 weeks he had been mourning, fasting, seeking the face of God with a desperation that came from a prophet who sensed the shifting of invisible kingdoms. No choice food passed his lips, no wine touched his tongue, no oil anointed his body. For 21 days, Daniel pressed into the throne room of heaven, wrestling with the Almighty for answers that seemed locked behind bars of bronze. And then, it happened. On the 24th day of the 1st month, as Daniel stood by the banks of the great river Tigris, the veil between worlds was torn open like a curtain ripped by lightning. Before him appeared a being of such terrifying beauty that his strength fled from his body like water poured upon sand. The messenger's face blazed like lightning. His eyes burned like torches of fire. His arms and feet gleamed like polished bronze, and when he spoke, his voice thundered like the roar of a multitude. But it wasn't the glory of this heavenly being that shook Daniel to his core. It was what the angel said next, words that would forever change how we understand the invisible war raging over the nations of earth. "Do not fear, Daniel," the messenger declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a sword through silk. "For from the first day that you set your heart to understand and humbled yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words." But then came the revelation that would make Daniel's blood run cold. "But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. Let that sink into your spirit for a moment. An angel of the living God, a being of pure light and power, had been held back, delayed, resisted, not by human armies, not by earthly kingdoms, but by a spiritual entity so powerful that it took 21 days of cosmic warfare to break through its defenses. This was no ordinary angel speaking to Daniel. This was likely Gabriel himself, the same messenger who had announced the birth of Christ to Mary. Yet even Gabriel, the herald of the Almighty, could not penetrate the spiritual stronghold that had been erected over Persia, until Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me. The angel continued, "For I had been left alone there, with the kings of Persia. Michael, the archangel, the commander of heaven's armies, the one whose very name means, 'Who is like God?' Even Michael had to be called into this cosmic battle to break the deadlock that had raged in the heavens over the empire of Persia." What does this tell us? What truth is hidden in this supernatural encounter that shakes the very foundations of how we view world events? It tells us that behind every earthly kingdom stands a spiritual power. Behind every nation's policies, every ruler's decisions, every empire's rise and fall, there are invisible forces warring for dominion over the hearts and minds of humanity. The Prince of Persia wasn't Cyrus, it wasn't Darius. It was a fallen angel, a territorial spirit assigned to that region, working tirelessly to resist God's purposes and blind the people to his truth. This Prince of Persia still walks the earth today. The same dark entity that delayed Gabriel's message to Daniel is the same force that whispers hatred into the ears of Iran's leaders. The same spirit that sought to prevent Israel's restoration under Cyrus is the same principality that today fuels Iran's obsession with Israel's destruction. Do you see it now? Do you understand why Iran's hatred of Israel seems to transcend politics? Why it feels almost supernatural in its intensity? It's because it is supernatural. The Prince of Persia has been assigned one mission for over 2 millennia: to destroy the covenant people of God. He failed when Haman built his gallows. He failed when the Babylonian exile was meant to be permanent. And he will fail again when the final war comes. But here's what should make your spirit tremble, with both fear and hope. If the Prince of Persia is real, if territorial spirits truly govern the affairs of nations, then the spiritual battle you face in your own life is just as real. That delay you've been experiencing, that breakthrough that seems just out of reach, that prayer that feels like it's bouncing off the ceiling. What if it's not God saying no? What if it's a prince assigned to your territory, holding back the very blessing God is trying to send? Daniel fasted for 21 days before his answer broke through, not because God was slow to hear, but because a war was raging in the heavens. Your answer may be delayed, not because God has forgotten you, but because Michael himself is fighting on your behalf in realms you cannot see. The Apostle Paul understood this truth when he wrote, "We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Every conflict in the Middle East, every threat from Iran, every rocket fired at Israel, every peace treaty signed or broken, it's all part of a war that began in Eden and will end in Armageddon. The true war is not over land, it's over dominion. It's over whose kingdom will ultimately rule the earth. And here's the profound truth that should set your heart on fire. If the Prince of Persia required Michael's intervention to be overcome, if Gabriel himself needed backup to break through the spiritual resistance over Iran, then what does that tell us about the power God has given to his praying saints? When you intercede for Israel, you are joining a battle that archangels fight. When you pray for Iran's people to come to faith, you are wielding weapons that can bind territorial spirits. When you stand in the gap for the lost and the broken, you are participating in a cosmic war where the fate of nations hangs in the balance. The prince of Persia thought he had won when he delayed Gabriel for 21 days, but he only succeeded in revealing to Daniel and to us that the real battle has always been spiritual. That behind the curtain of earthly politics stands an invisible kingdom where the true decisions are made. But Persia's future would not only be forged by angels and kings, it would be sealed in scrolls of final judgment. A storm rises from the north, but Persia marches at its side. In the darkest hour of Israel's exile, when Jerusalem lay in ashes and the temple stones were scattered like forgotten prayers, the prophet Ezekiel stood by the river Chebar. His people were captives in a foreign land. Their hope was buried beneath the rubble of Babylon. And yet, in that moment of deepest despair, heaven tore open like an ancient scroll, and God showed him something that would make the blood freeze in his veins. What Ezekiel saw was not comfort. It was not restoration. It was a vision so terrifying, so final, that it would echo through the corridors of time until the very end of days. He saw the last war, the final rebellion, and standing in the shadow of that cosmic battlefield was a name that should have been familiar, but now carried the stench of betrayal. Persia. The same Persia that had once freed God's people was now marching to destroy them. Listen carefully to the words that came from the throne of the Almighty. Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. But Gog would not march alone. Oh no. Behind him would come a coalition so vast, so terrible, that it would cover the land like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets. Do you hear it? Do you feel the weight of those words? Persia, modern-day Iran, standing not as Israel's protector, but as her destroyer. The very nation that God had once called my anointed would now become the instrument of the final test. But this was no random alliance. This was no mere geopolitical maneuvering. This was the culmination of a spiritual war that had been raging since the Garden of Eden. For you see, the war of Gog and Magog is not about territory. It is not about oil or politics or ancient grudges. It is about one question that has haunted creation since the serpent first whispered doubt into human ears: who truly rules this world? And God, in his infinite wisdom and terrible justice, would use this final rebellion to answer that question once and for all. Picture it: Israel dwelling securely in their land, their walls torn down, their guard let down, living in what they believe is lasting peace. They have rebuilt their cities, replanted their vineyards, and their children play in streets that once ran red with the blood of martyrs. And then, like a nightmare made flesh, the armies of the earth converge upon them. From the north comes Gog with his vast hordes. From the south comes Cush, the ancient lands of Africa. From the west comes Put, Libya and her allies. And from the east, like a dark shadow falling across the promised land, comes Persia with her banners flying and her weapons gleaming in the dying light. You will advance against my people Israel, like a cloud that covers the land, God declares through his prophet. In days to come, Gog, I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am proved holy through you before their eyes. Do you see the divine irony? Do you grasp the terrible beauty of God's plan? He is not caught off guard by this invasion. He is not scrambling to defend his people. No, he is the one orchestrating it. He is drawing the enemies of his covenant into the greatest trap in human history. For just when it seems that Israel is about to be wiped from the face of the earth, just when the world begins to whisper that perhaps God has finally abandoned his chosen people, just when the cameras of the world are focused on what appears to be the final solution to the Jewish question, that is when God will rise from his throne. In that day, when Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord. In my zeal and fiery wrath I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. The earth itself will convulse, mountains will crumble, buildings will collapse. And in that moment, the armies of the earth, Gog, Magog, Persia, and all their allies will realize they have not come to fight Israel. They have come to fight God himself. But the earthquake will be just the beginning. Fire will rain from heaven like the judgment that once fell on Sodom. Hailstones the size of boulders will crash down upon the invading armies. Plague and bloodshed will sweep through their ranks. And in their terror and confusion, they will turn their weapons upon each other, fulfilling the ancient pattern. Every man's sword will be against his brother. The God who once parted the Red Sea will part the heavens. The God who once rained fire on Egypt will rain fire on the enemies of his covenant. And Persia, proud Persia, who once carried the vessels of the temple with reverence, will drink the cup of his wrath to the very dregs. But here is the mystery that will shake you to your core. Why would God allow Persia to fall so far? Why would he permit the nation that once served his purposes to become the instrument of the final rebellion? Because, beloved, this is how God writes his stories. This is how he reveals his character to a watching world. He uses the rise and fall of nations like notes in a cosmic symphony, each playing their part in a composition that only he can fully comprehend. Persia's judgment, in the war of Gog and Magog, will not be the judgment of a forgotten enemy. It will be the judgment of a once favored servant who chose rebellion over redemption. It will be the final proof that no nation, no matter how mightily God has used them, is beyond the reach of his justice if they set themselves against his covenant people. And when the smoke clears and the dead are buried and the weapons are burned as fuel for 7 years, the world will know something they had forgotten, that the God of Israel still lives, still reigns, and still keeps his promise 7 when those promises include both mercy and judgment. What if God defends what he has chosen even when the world no longer believes it's chosen at all? The vision ends, but its echo reverberates through time. Every news report from the Middle East, every threat from Tehran, every missile that flies toward Jerusalem, all of it is moving toward this moment. The moment when heaven and earth collide, when the patience of the Almighty reaches its end, and when the final question of human history receives its answer. But if judgment has a beginning, could it also hold a hidden door to mercy? Elam will fall, but her story will not end in smoke. In the forgotten corners of prophecy, where most eyes never dare to wander, lies a judgment so specific, so surgical, that it bears the fingerprints of divine precision. The prophet Jeremiah, his voice echoing across the centuries like thunder rolling through empty valleys, spoke words that would shake the very foundations of what we now call southwestern Iran. But this wasn't just another oracle of doom. This was something far more mysterious, something that would reveal the heart of God in ways that make theologians tremble and skeptics pause in wonder. Listen closely to the words that pierce the silence of eternity. Thus says the Lord of hosts, "Behold, I will break the bow of Elam, the mainstay of their might. And I will bring upon Elam the 4 winds from the 4 quarters of heaven, and I will scatter them to all those winds, and there shall be no nation to which those driven out of Elam shall not come." The bow of Elam. Think about that phrase for a moment. Not their armies, not their cities, not even their kings, their bow. The very symbol of their military prowess, their ability to strike from a distance, their pride in warfare. God wasn't just promising defeat. He was promising the complete dismantling of everything they trusted in for protection. Elam had been a power that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. Archaeological evidence shows us a kingdom that flourished when Egypt was still finding its voice, when Babylon was but a collection of mud huts along the Euphrates. These were the people who had mastered metallurgy, who had built ziggurats that scraped the belly of heaven, who had armies that could darken the horizon with their arrows. And yet, with surgical precision, the God of Israel declared that their greatest strength would become their greatest weakness. Their bow would be broken, not bent, not damaged, broken. But here's where the prophecy takes a turn that has left scholars scratching their heads for millennia. Just when you think the verdict is final, just when you assume Elam is destined for the ash heap of history, Jeremiah drops a line that changes everything. "But in the latter days I will restore the fortunes of Elam," declares the Lord. Restoration after judgment, mercy after wrath, hope after devastation. Do you understand what this means? This isn't just about an ancient kingdom in what is now Iran. This is about the very nature of God himself. This is about a divine pattern that runs like a golden thread through the entire tapestry of Scripture. God breaks in order to rebuild. He scatters in order to regather. He humbles in order to exalt. What if I told you that this prophecy is still unfolding before our very eyes? What if the nation that once sent armies against Jerusalem is being prepared to send something entirely different? What if the land that has threatened annihilation for decades is secretly being shaped for participation in the greatest revival the world has ever seen? The historical fulfillment of Jeremiah's words came with devastating accuracy. When Alexander the Great swept through the Persian Empire like wildfire, Elam fell. When the Parthians rose to power, the Elamites were scattered. When Islam conquered Persia, the ancient culture of Elam was buried beneath layers of foreign conquest and religious transformation. But the breaking of the bow wasn't just military defeat. It was spiritual preparation. Because sometimes God has to destroy what we trust in before he can give us what we truly need. Consider the haunting reality of modern Iran, a nation that has poured its treasure into missiles and nuclear ambitions, into proxy wars and terrorist networks. A nation whose leaders wake each morning plotting the destruction of Israel. A nation whose bow, its military might, has become its obsession, its idol, its false hope. And yet, beneath the surface of this theocratic regime, something unprecedented is happening. Underground house churches are multiplying at a rate that makes Iranian authorities tremble. Young Iranians are converting to Christianity in numbers that would have been unimaginable just a generation ago. Dreams and visions of Jesus are being reported across the country with such frequency that even secular media has taken notice. Could it be that the breaking of Elam's bow isn't just about ancient military defeat? Could it be that God is systematically dismantling everything Iran trusts in, its military might, its regional influence, its economic stability, in order to prepare the hearts of its people for something infinitely greater? The restoration promised in Jeremiah 49 isn't just political, it's spiritual. It's the kind of transformation that turns persecutors into worshipers, that changes the enemies of God's people into their greatest allies. Think about the Apostle Paul. Before he became the great missionary to the Gentiles, he was Saul of Tarsus, breathing threats and murder against the disciples of Jesus. God didn't just save Paul. He shattered his confidence in his own righteousness, broke his religious pride, scattered his plans and ambitions to the four winds. And then, in the aftermath of that divine demolition, he rebuilt Paul into something the former Pharisee could never have imagined. What if the same pattern is playing out on a national scale with Iran? What if every economic sanction, every diplomatic isolation, every internal uprising is part of God's surgical process of breaking the bow that this nation has trusted in for far too long? The prophecy speaks of the latter days, a phrase that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you realize we might be living in them right now. The restoration of Elam isn't just ancient history, it's future promise. It's a glimpse into a moment when the nation that has spent decades shouting death to Israel might one day join the chorus singing Hosanna to the Son of David. But here's the most staggering part of this prophecy. It reveals something about the character of God that should make every believer fall to their knees in worship, and every skeptic reconsider their assumptions about divine justice. God doesn't just punish sin, he redeems it. He doesn't just destroy the wicked, he transforms them. The bow that once shot arrows at Jerusalem might one day be restrung to send arrows of prayer toward heaven. The hands that once gripped weapons of war might one day be raised in surrender to the Prince of Peace. The voices that once chanted death might one day proclaim life. This isn't wishful thinking. This is biblical prophecy. This is the promise of a God whose mercy triumphs over judgment, whose love is more persistent than human hatred, whose grace is more powerful than generational curses. As we watch the headlines unfold in our time, as we see Iran's bow growing stronger and more threatening with each passing month, remember Jeremiah's words. Remember that God has a habit of using the most unlikely people to accomplish his most amazing purposes. Remember that the nation he judges may also be the nation he's preparing to revive. Because Persia once sent an army, but now it may send worshipers. They followed the light, and it led them from Persia to the feet of God. Picture this moment, if you can. The night sky over ancient Mesopotamia burns with impossible fire. A star not like any star the astronomers had charted, not following any celestial pattern they had memorized blazes with the intensity of divine announcement. And in the shadowed chambers where the wisdom of Daniel still echoes, where the scrolls of Hebrew prophecy gather dust beside Persian astronomical charts, the Magi lift their eyes and know, this is not coincidence. This is appointment. What if I told you that the same land that would one day threaten Israel's annihilation was the first to kneel before her Messiah? The year is somewhere between 6 and 4 BC. In Jerusalem, Herod sits on his blood-soaked throne, paranoid and calculating. The priests shuffle through their temple duties, blind to the cosmic drama unfolding above their heads. The people of Israel, God's chosen, sleep in their beds, unaware that heaven itself has torn open to announce the arrival of their long-awaited king. But in Persia, in the land of Daniel's exile, where Jewish prophecy had been preserved in foreign courts, wise men are packing for a journey that will change everything. These were not casual stargazers. These were the Magith, priestly class of ancient Persia, inheritors of a tradition that reached back through Zoroaster. through the courts of Cyrus, through the very halls where Daniel once interpreted dreams for kings. They were astronomer priests, keeper of ancient wisdom, men who understood that the movement of stars was the handwriting of God across the canvas of eternity. And they had been waiting. For generations, they had been waiting. You see, when Daniel was carried into Babylonian captivity, when he rose to become chief among the wise men of that empire, he didn't just interpret dreams, he planted seeds. Seeds of Hebrew prophecy in foreign soil, the promise of Numbers 24-17 burned in their collective memory. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. Daniel's prophecy in chapter 9 had given them a timeline 70 weeks, 490 years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince would come. They had been counting. They had been calculating. They had been watching the skies with the patience of men who knew that God's promises don't expire with human lifetimes. And then, the star appeared. Not a comet blazing across the sky and vanishing, not a conjunction of planets creating momentary brilliance. This was something else entirely. This was a herald, a divine spotlight, a celestial finger pointing toward the promise of the ages. And when they saw it, they knew the time had come. The king had been born. Can you imagine the conversations in those Persian chambers? The careful consultation of scrolls, the intense debate over ancient texts, the growing conviction that they were living in the hinge moment of history. These were not impulsive men. These were scholars who understood the weight of what they were contemplating. A journey of hundreds of miles across dangerous territory, following a star toward a promise written in Hebrew scriptures, carrying treasures worthy of a king to worship a child they had never seen. Conclusion. And so the ancient scrolls whisper their final words, but not their final truth. From the misty highlands of Madai to the golden courts of Cyrus, from the lion's den where Daniel prayed to the gallows where Haman fell, from the star that guided eastern kings to the missiles that threaten Jerusalem today, we have traced the fingerprints of eternity across the rise and fall of empires. Persia, Iran, a nation caught between two destinies, suspended between judgment and mercy like a pendulum swinging through the corridors of time. What have we witnessed in this journey through the sacred pages? We have seen a God who writes history before it happens, who names kings before they are born, who uses the enemies of his people to become their deliverers. We have watched as the same soil that once birthed Cyrus the Liberator now breeds threats of annihilation. We have traced the golden thread of prophecy from Genesis to Revelation, watching as each strand weaves into a tapestry so intricate, so precise, that only divine hands could have designed it. But perhaps the most staggering revelation is this: God's story with Persia is not finished. In the hidden verses of Jeremiah, in the mysterious promises buried beneath centuries of judgment, we find whispers of restoration. In the latter days, I will restore the fortunes of Elam. Not just political restoration, not just geographic boundaries redrawn on maps, but spiritual restoration. Hearts turned, minds transformed. Worship, where once there was warfare. Could it be that the underground churches multiplying across Iran today are not coincidence, but prophecy? Could it be that every economic pressure, every diplomatic isolation, every crack in the regime's foundation is part of God's surgical process of breaking the bow this nation has trusted in for far too long? Could it be that we are living witnesses to the greatest spiritual revolution the Middle East has seen since the first century church exploded across the known world? The headlines scream of nuclear threats and proxy wars, of missiles and martyrs, of ancient hatreds dressed in modern uniforms. But what if the real story is being written in the secret places, in the house churches meeting in basements and back rooms, in the dreams and visions that are turning the children of Ishmael toward the son of Abraham? What if Persia's greatest hour is not behind her, but ahead of her? You see, friend, the God we serve is not just the God of Israel. He is the God of the nations. The same hand that called Abraham out of Ur, that raised up Moses from the bulrushes, that turned Saul of Tarsus into Paul the Apostle, that same hand is still moving through the affairs of men, still calling, still converting, still conquering hearts with grace. The Persia that once sent Cyrus to rebuild the temple may one day send pilgrims to worship there. The Iran that now funds terror may one day fund revival. The hands that grip rockets aimed at Jerusalem may one day be raised in surrender to the Prince of Peace. This is not wishful thinking. This is biblical prophecy. This is the pattern of a God whose mercy triumphs over judgment, whose love outlasts hatred, whose purpose cannot be thwarted by human rebellion. As you sit in your chair tonight, as you process what you have heard, remember this. You are not just studying ancient history. You are watching the unfolding of eternal destiny. The prophecies written by men who lived millennia ago are being fulfilled in the newspapers you read tomorrow morning. Israel remains God's chosen people not because they earned it, but because God's gifts and calling are irrevocable. But their story is intertwined with the story of all nations, including the very nation that threatens them today. The valley of dry bones is stirring, the fig tree is budding, the eastern winds are shifting, and somewhere in the mountains of Iran, in the hidden places where faith grows in the darkness, the same God who once moved the heart of Cyrus is moving again. So watch, pray, listen for the footsteps of the divine as he walks through the corridors of current events. Listen for the sound of breaking bows and rising altars. Listen for the whisper of restoration in the wind. Because the final chapter of Persia's story may be the most beautiful one yet. The land that once sent armies against Jerusalem may one day join the procession singing, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The scroll is still unrolled. Impulsive men. These were scholars who understood the weight of what they were contemplating. A journey of hundreds of miles across dangerous territory, following a star toward a promise written in Hebrew scriptures, carrying treasures worthy of a king to worship a child they had never seen. Conclusion. And so the ancient scrolls whisper their final words, but not their final truth. From the misty highlands of Madai to the golden courts of Cyrus, from the lion's den where Daniel prayed to the gallows where Haman fell, from the star that guided eastern kings to the missiles that threaten Jerusalem today, we have traced the fingerprints of eternity across the rise and fall of empires. Persia, Iran, a nation caught between two destinies, suspended between judgment and mercy like a pendulum swinging through the corridors of time. What have we witnessed in this journey through the sacred pages? We have seen a God who writes history before it happens, who names kings before they are born, who uses the enemies of his people to become their deliverers. We have watched as the same soil that once birthed Cyrus the Liberator now breeds threats of annihilation. We have traced the golden thread of prophecy from Genesis to Revelation, watching as each strand weaves into a tapestry so intricate, so precise, that only divine hands could have designed it. But perhaps the most staggering revelation is this: God's story with Persia is not finished. In the hidden verses of Jeremiah, in the mysterious promises buried beneath centuries of judgment, we find whispers of restoration. In the latter days, I will restore the fortunes of Elam. Not just political restoration, not just geographic boundaries redrawn on maps, but spiritual restoration. Hearts turned, minds transformed. Worship, where once there was warfare. Could it be that the underground churches multiplying across Iran today are not coincidence, but prophecy? Could it be that every economic pressure, every diplomatic isolation, every crack in the regime's foundation is part of God's surgical process of breaking the bow this nation has trusted in for far too long? Could it be that we are living witnesses to the greatest spiritual revolution the Middle East has seen since the first-century church exploded across the known world? The headlines scream of nuclear threats and proxy wars, of missiles and martyrs, of ancient hatreds dressed in modern uniforms. But what if the real story is being written in the secret places, in the house churches meeting in basements and back rooms, in the dreams and visions that are turning the children of Ishmael toward the son of Abraham? What if Persia's greatest hour is not behind her, but ahead of her? You see, friend, the God we serve is not just the God of Israel. He is the God of the nations. The same hand that called Abraham out of Ur, that raised up Moses from the bulrushes, that turned Saul of Tarsus into Paul the Apostle, that same hand is still moving through the affairs of men, still calling, still converting, still conquering hearts with grace. The Persia that once sent Cyrus to rebuild the temple may one day send pilgrims to worship there. The Iran that now funds terror may one day fund revival. The hands that grip rockets aimed at Jerusalem may one day be raised in surrender to the Prince of Peace. This is not wishful thinking. This is biblical prophecy. This is the pattern of a God whose mercy triumphs over judgment, whose love outlasts hatred, whose purpose cannot be thwarted by human rebellion. As you sit in your chair tonight, as you process what you have heard, remember this: you are not just studying ancient history. You are watching the unfolding of eternal destiny. The prophecies written by men who lived millennia ago are being fulfilled in the newspapers you read tomorrow morning. Israel remains God's chosen people not because they earned it, but because God's gifts and calling are irrevocable. But their story is intertwined with the story of all nations, including the very nation that threatens them today. The valley of dry bones is stirring, the fig tree is budding, the eastern winds are shifting, and somewhere in the mountains of Iran, in the hidden places where faith grows in the darkness, the same God who once moved the heart of Cyrus is moving again. So watch, pray, listen for the footsteps of the divine as he walks through the corridors of current events. Listen for the sound of breaking bows and rising altars. Listen for the whisper of restoration in the wind. Because the final chapter of Persia's story may be the most beautiful one yet. The land that once sent armies against Jerusalem may one day join the procession singing, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The scroll is still unrolling. The story is still being written. And in God's sovereign hand, even the ashes of judgment can become the foundation of altars. Persia's bow may be broken, but her knees may yet bow in worship. Impulsive men. These were scholars who understood the weight of what they were contemplating. A journey of hundreds of miles across dangerous territory, following a star toward a promise written in Hebrew scriptures, carrying treasures worthy of a king to worship a child they had never seen. Conclusion. And so the ancient scrolls whisper their final words, but not their final truth. From the misty highlands of Madai to the golden courts of Cyrus, from the lion's den where Daniel prayed to the gallows where Haman fell, from the star that guided eastern kings to the missiles that threaten Jerusalem today, we have traced the fingerprints of eternity across the rise and fall of empires. Persia, Iran, a nation caught between two destinies, suspended between judgment and mercy like a pendulum swinging through the corridors of time. What have we witnessed in this journey through the sacred pages? We have seen a God who writes history before it happens, who names kings before they are born, who uses the enemies of his people to become their deliverers. We have watched as the same soil that once birthed Cyrus the Liberator now breeds threats of annihilation. We have traced the golden thread of prophecy from Genesis to Revelation, watching as each strand weaves into a tapestry so intricate, so precise, that only divine hands could have designed it. But perhaps the most staggering revelation is this: God's story with Persia is not finished. In the hidden verses of Jeremiah, in the mysterious promises buried beneath centuries of judgment, we find whispers of restoration. In the latter days, I will restore the fortunes of Elam. Not just political restoration, not just geographic boundaries redrawn on maps, but spiritual restoration. Hearts turned, minds transformed. Worship, where once there was warfare. Could it be that the underground churches multiplying across Iran today are not coincidence, but prophecy? Could it be that every economic pressure, every diplomatic isolation, every crack in the regime's foundation is part of God's surgical process of breaking the bow this nation has trusted in for far too long? Could it be that we are living witnesses to the greatest spiritual revolution the Middle East has seen since the first-century church exploded across the known world? The headlines scream of nuclear threats and proxy wars, of missiles and martyrs, of ancient hatreds dressed in modern uniforms. But what if the real story is being written in the secret places? In the house churches meeting in basements and back rooms, in the dreams and visions that are turning the children of Ishmael toward the son of Abraham? What if Persia's greatest hour is not behind her, but ahead of her? You see, friend, the God we serve is not just the God of Israel. He is the God of the nations. The same hand that called Abraham out of Ur, that raised up Moses from the bulrushes, that turned Saul of Tarsus into Paul the Apostle, that same hand is still moving through the affairs of men, still calling,